Well, our grand tour is now going to finally arrive at the 20th century. And this is where we're going to be spending most of the rest of this class, spending time with the innovative artwork that was being created by avant garde movements. Now, if you've already read your book, you'll know that avant garde is a fancy French word. It's a military term for the front line of soldiers that marches to meet the enemy first. And this was a term that these young artists in the early 20th century adopted for themselves because, in many ways, they were explorers. They were charting new territory and going into unexplored realms of art, things that had never been done before in the thousands and thousands of years that people had been making paintings and sculptures. So, I want to explore early 20th century avant garde in this podcast. The first movement we're going to look at is another ism. Here come more isms. This is Fauvism. And this is a movement that very much grew out of Post-Impressionism. If you'll recall, the Post-Impressionists such as Toulouse-Lautrec, Gauguin, and Van Gogh were doing new things with color. They were liberating color from its descriptive role of simply literally telling the color of things. And they're beginning to use color in more creative ways for purposes of emotional expression. They were changing the colors of real world objects because it just felt right and it seemed good. And the artists who were part of Fauvism, known as the Fauves, did that and took it up a notch. In fact, they went crazy with color. And the whole reason they were called the Fauves is because that is the French word for wild beasts. And when some of these artists were exhibiting their paintings, their colors were so crazy and so saturated and bright that one French critic, who was kind of freaked out, referred to them as wild beasts because their colors were so wild and crazy. The quintessential Fauve artist is a guy named Andre Derain. He is really interested in creating a picture that follows its own rules in terms of color. It may or may not have any relation to the actual scene that's in front of his eyes. So look at this first image, London Bridge. Durand painted quite a few pictures of London. And check it out. We have an orange sky, blue buildings, green water with little sort of blue ripples on them, red boats, and red parts of the bridge. This is a painting that is not entirely divorced from reality. He most likely sat in front of the bridge or got a photo of it and painted from it to get the basic structure. But he's putting whatever colors he wants into this picture. One of the things that we're going to see as we get further and further into the 20th century is the idea of artists working from kind of their own internal vision. Less and less they are just trying to copy the outside world, and more they're turning to the interior. They are doing what they want to do, what they feel inside. And Fauvism is a great example of color being used in an intuitive sense and not a descriptive sense. So this is a great example of that. This next work by Duran is a portrait of a fellow Fauve artist, Henri Matisse, who we're going to talk about in a second. Look at the crazy colors. I mean, Gauguin was a pretty colorful painter, but this goes way beyond Gauguin. We have these strong, bright reds in the beard and this kind of blue-green on the shadowed side of his face. Almost everything is some sort of saturated, ramped up color. And you can look at this and kind of see why, in a world of more muted paintings, a critic would describe these artists as wild beasts. And here is even more Durand, if you hadn't gotten the idea already. Here's another one of his famous fauve works called The Turning Road. Tree trunks that change from blue to red, arbitrarily applied yellows and oranges, a few greens there to remind us there actually is some green foliage in the world. But this is color that has basically gone crazy. Duran is an artist who is using color for emotional expression. I should mention that Fauvism was a movement that lasted no longer than about 5 years. After that time, most of the Fauve artists had kind of gone their separate ways. And Duran uh, turned away from it and he started doing this almost neoclassical kind of work. So it's kind of interesting to see his early work and his late work because they're very, very different. One artist that really stuck with Fauve principles for a while, and in fact, much longer than anyone else. In fact, he pretty much his whole life he stuck with Fauve principles, was Henri Matisse, who is undoubtedly one of the artistic giants of the 20th century. Matisse, when he was young, was told by his teacher that he was born to simplify painting, and that's what he did. Matisse had a massive influence on 20th century art. He reduced painting to very simple forms, calling attention to line and shape and color, and he was very interested in these bright, saturated colors his entire life. Let's check out some Matisse work. Here is his painting, Harmony in Red, The Red Room. And look at how far he has gone from observed reality. We look at this painting and it seems very flat. It seems very decorative. We don't see any chiaroscuro at all. It's almost like paper cutouts. And you get a sense from this painting that the idea is sort of just to revel in color and shape. And kind of like Renoir, Matisse is one of these artists who never paints a depressing picture. All of his pictures are like really upbeat. In fact, he makes no bones about wanting to be an artist of upbeat subject matter. He says this: "What I dream of is an art of balance, of purity and serenity, devoid of any troubling or depressing subject matter. An art that might be for every mental worker, be he businessman or writer, like an appeasing influence, like a mental soother, something like a good armchair." So he wants his art to be very pleasant to look at so that when you're checking it out, it's almost like falling back into your most comfortable chair. And whether or not he succeeds in this goal is probably dependent on your personality and also which Matisse you're looking at. But no doubt about it, brilliant fauve-like colors dominate Matisse's work. Back to the Red Room. Notice a few things about it. Notice, for example, that a woman is putting fruit on a table, and there's a tablecloth on the table, and it has a certain pattern on it. And this pattern is repeated on the wallpaper of the room that is behind her. So it's almost like the tablecloth and the wallpaper sort of flow into each other in a very flat way. We have very little in the way of indicating perspective, sort of a suggestion of the perspective of the table, but no really strong lines that lay it out. All of this red is kind of alleviated by on the upper left hand side of the picture, there's either a painting hanging on the wall or perhaps it's a window to a scene outside, and we have some greens and blues that kind of help balance out this red. Remember, Matisse is working off of sensation and emotion. He's putting color in because it feels right. Here is a quote from Matisse talking about how he uses color in its relationship to nature. He says this: "I cannot copy nature in a servile way. I am forced to interpret nature and submit it to the spirit of the picture. The chief function of color should be to serve expression as well as possible. My choice of colors does not rest on any scientific theory. I simply try to put down colors which render my sensation." So again, this is an utterly subjective use of color. This next painting and kind of the story behind it really serve to emphasize this philosophy of Matisse's. Look at it. We have a portrait of a woman, and there are crazy colors in the background behind her, and there's this swipe of green paint that goes straight down the middle of her face. In fact, it is so prominent that Matisse decided to title this picture The Green Stripe, and in parentheses, Madame Matisse. This is actually a portrait of his wife. And but the fact that it's not simply named Madame Matisse is noteworthy. There was a story that a critic saw this and said, "That's not a woman, it's just paint smeared on the canvas, it's just a painting." And Matisse said, "Exactly. I set out to create a painting, not a woman." So here is someone who is putting sort of color in a top priority. in his picture making. He's not as interested in making something realistic. He's more interested in using color to express his feelings. Just real quickly, let's look at some more Matisse paintings. Here is another portrait of his wife. Uh, she's wearing kind of this cool looking headdress, and really the whole thing is just an excuse for Matisse to explore color and shape. He loves curving organic forms and he loves patterns. You have a sense that if Matisse had not become a painter, he would have wanted to decorate wallpaper or create patterns for dresses and clothing. Look at this face. It's kind of outlined. It doesn't even have the same sense of light and shadow that the previous painting had. There's something almost like a coloring book about it. Another image of Matisse, joie de vivre, the joy of life. Here are a bunch of naked people kind of hanging out in a field. There are people playing flutes, there are people kissing and just joining hands and dancing in a circle in the background. Remember, Matisse never paints a depressing picture. It's always upbeat, and this is one of his happiest pictures. Look at all the bright, saturated colors. And think too about the spirit of this picture. I look at this painting and I think of Hieronymus Bosch. Do you remember him? He was that Renaissance painter that we looked at who had the Garden of Earthly Delights triptych. Remember the scene that has all the naked people sort of having this weird kind of orgy thing and living in sin. I kind of compare it to this, except it has a different spirit. Bosch is saying this sort of behavior is hedonistic and immoral and sinful. And here Matisse has kind of similar themes, naked people carousing, but he's saying this is happy, this is what life is all about, and perhaps this is what the Garden of Eden would be like. So, again, a very different spirit from Hieronymus Bosch. And this painting is very typical of Matisse. And here's even more Matisse, La Musique. You can probably guess what that translates to. Here are a couple of women sitting, and there's some sheet music in the foreground. There is a guitar that's held by one of the women. There is no attempt here to make these women realistically proportioned. Look at the big hands. Also, look at the way perspective is ignored. The sheet music sort of comes forward and tilts towards us. Remember, Cezanne started that with his crazy dishes and plates. Look in the background. We have these big plants. This is one of Matisse's favorite shapes, and he would repeat it again and again in many of his pictures. And this painting depicts not only his love of bright colors, but also his love of pattern and texture. We have sort of a tile floor and wall behind these women in addition to those plants that are on the wall. More people dancing. You gotta love it. He did a couple of versions of this painting. One is in New York and this one is in Russia. The dance, just some orange people holding hands, dancing in a circle. Remember that quote about Matisse, you were born to simplify painting, and this is one of those works that really exemplifies that quote. It's so simple and so flat. It's just pure decoration. Towards the end of his life, Matisse even gets simpler, if that were possible. He begins to experiment with cut paper instead of paint. He will take sheets of construction paper or he'll paint paper and cut out shapes and glue them down. And he did a whole series of these. This is part of that series. It's called Icarus, referencing the mythological figure who had wings of feathers held together by wax, and he flew too close to the sun, and the wax melted and he fell to earth. So here is a figure. Perhaps he's falling through the heavens. We have these yellow shapes that suggest stars, maybe which, or maybe the sun, or maybe bits of his flaming wings that are falling with him. But this is made out of cut paper. In fact, if you look closely, you can see places on the blue where there are edges of the paper where they have been glued down. And last, here is a super simple Matisse composition, and it is even more abstracted than the Icarus work. This is also cut paper. It's called l'escargot, or the snail. You know, people say escargot. This is escargot. And there's a snail in there, but you have to look really closely. It mainly exists in the fact that these pieces of paper seem to spiral, kind of like a snail's shell. You can start with the green paper at the center and then move to the black and then red and then yellow and orange and so forth, and see these little shapes of paper spiraling outwards. Look at how abstract this is. Matisse is simplifying and reducing. In many ways, he's fulfilling that prophecy that was spoken about him by his teacher. Towards the end of his life, Matisse became bedridden. He was sick in bed, but he still kept on creating art. He had assistants tie pieces of charcoal to long sticks and then put paper on the ceiling or the wall, and he would use that long stick to make drawings. He would still cut out pieces of paper and glue them together in compositions while he was in bed. So this guy was an artist all the way to the end. And if you like bright color and if you like decoration and flat shapes, Matisse is your guy. If you were going to reduce the 20th century to two artists, it would probably be Matisse and one other artist named Picasso. And if I were forced, if someone held a gun to my head and said, you have to pick the most influential artist of the 20th century, I would have to pick Pablo Picasso. This is the next artist we're going to look at. And he's so important that he is going to occupy fully half of our podcast here. We're going to look at a lot of his works. He was someone who was extremely talented and extremely versatile. But before we get into all that, let's talk about his origins. Unlike many of the artists that we've been looking at, Picasso was not French. He was Spanish. And being a Spaniard, had a very long name. Check this out. This is his full name: Pablo Diego Jose Francisco de Paula Juan Nepomuceno Maria de los Remedios Cipriano de la Santísima Trinidad Clito Ruiz y Picasso. I'm not lying. I'm not making that up. That is his full name. So I'm really thankful that most of us know him just by Pablo Picasso or Pablo. That's how we will talk about him in this podcast. Definitely one of the, I would say, the sort of central artist of the 20th century. At a very early age, he had acquired an immense amount of skill. His dad was an artist. Supposedly, his first words were pencil, pencil, as he begged his mother for something to draw with. Now, by the time he was in his teens, he was basically as good a draftsman as, say, Raphael. I mean, he was really good at drawing. He could capture likenesses with almost photographic accuracy. Here are a couple of examples of that. Here's a self-portrait from when he was a teenager, self-portrait with uncombed hair. And here's another work that was actually featured in your book, First Communion, completed when he was 15 years old. Now, many artists spend their entire lives trying to get as good as Picasso was when he was 15 years old. And you can imagine if at an early age you master photographic realism, that you can paint and draw anything that you see super realistically, you might start getting bored or at least restless. So while one of the stereotypes about abstract artists is that they do abstraction because they're lousy at drawing, which in the case of some artists might certainly be true, it's not the case for Picasso. He has an immense amount of skill, and he leans into abstraction and stylization, probably because he's already mastered perfect observational, representational drawing and painting. So keep that in mind. And you should also know that throughout his life, he kind of went back and forth. He might do a realistic painting one day and then a cubist sculpture the next day. He was just so versatile and so talented that he did it all. As a young man, Picasso entered the Barcelona Academy of Fine Arts. I think this is in the 1890s. And then after he had experimented with a wide range of sort of different artistic styles, he decided to go to Paris, where all the cutting edge happening art was being made at the time. So, in the first few years of the 20th century, that's where Picasso ends up. And when he first arrives in Paris, he is a cold, lonely, starving art student. And his first paintings in Paris reflect this. They are known as collectively as his blue period because so many of them have blue colors that predominate. Here's an example. This is called La Vie or Life. It's a really mysterious painting. It's from 1903. And we see a man and a nude woman on the left hand side. And apparently they're being confronted by a woman with a baby. And I'm not sure what this is about. Perhaps This man has taken this young woman as a lover, and he has ditched the woman on the right, with whom he had a child, and she's coming back to confront him. Maybe this young man and this young woman are seeing a vision of the baby they will produce. I don't know. But it sure is interesting and mysterious. It's made even more interesting by the fact that there are apparently drawings or pictures leaning against the wall at the back of the room. So it's metaphorical and mysterious, and it's not quite as realistic as the first two Picasso paintings we looked at. Already, Picasso was veering away from realism. The chiaroscuro isn't quite as accurate. The proportions are a little bit exaggerated, so already some abstraction is going on. A couple of other Blue period works. The first is The Blind Man's Meal, and just the subject matter of these paintings is often kind of depressing and sad. Here is a blind man who is reaching out his hand to get his water pitcher as he's eating this very simple, humble meal. Obviously, he's someone in poverty, and that probably reflects Picasso's poverty in Paris at this time. The Old Guitarist from 1903, another Blue Period picture. A man bends over. Perhaps he is having back trouble. Perhaps he's permanently bent over like that. But he's singing and playing guitar, maybe for change on the streets of Paris. And by the way, the melancholy mood of Picasso's Blue Period is probably influenced in part by the suicide of a friend of his in Paris at this time. Fortunately, I guess for his mental state, things got better. He got a girlfriend, got happier, and the colors in his paintings brightened up a little bit. He entered what is called his rose period, where kind of salmon colors and dusty rose colors begin to predominate his color palette in his paintings. So we see this in this work, Boy with a Pipe, although we haven't quite gotten rid of all the blues yet. By the way, this picture has fetched a lot of money. It is one of the highest priced paintings by anybody that's ever been sold. So it's kind of interesting. I think it's pretty good. I like it. Here's another rose period picture. Young girl with a goat. Why is she with the goat? Why is she naked? Why is she with a little naked kid with a pot on his head? I don't know. But maybe that's not very important. The thing is, you're supposed to feel pretty good looking at this picture. And again, it has those rosy colors in it. There's something that seems almost classical, Greco-Roman, mythological about this picture. So pretty interesting. During Picasso's Rose period, one of the motifs that we see uh, is that of the street performer. And in this next painting, Harlequin's Family with an Ape, we see that. Picasso during this time was painting a lot of clowns and acrobats and harlequins, people who made their living by performing. And in this kind of bizarre Rose period picture, we have a man and his wife and their kid, and then this monkey in the room with them. So perhaps they are part of a traveling circus, and the monkey just happens to share their tent with them. But kind of an interesting picture, certainly not as depressing as his Blue period work. So the Blue and Rose period represent Picasso's earliest years in Paris. Then, in the year 1907, Picasso paints this picture, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, or The Ladies of Avignon. And this is one of the most influential and important works in art history. We've already seen that Picasso's work has been getting more abstract from his earlier days, and this is just a quantum leap ahead in terms of abstraction. In terms of subject matter, this depicts prostitutes. These were prostitutes who worked on Avignon Street in Barcelona, so this may have been a place that Picasso visited. Also, early designs for the composition of this painting had men coming in from the side, sailors, as clients of the prostitutes, but at some point, Picasso decided to take those out. Now, what's really innovative about this painting is the way that Picasso treats the space. In one fell swoop, he is basically shattering the concept of linear perspective that has existed since the Renaissance. We don't have a realistic environment that these women are in. It is a fragmented world. It almost seems like someone has thrown a rock at a mirror, and we are looking at the shattered remains that are reflecting in the mirror. Not only the background, but the women's bodies themselves are kind of broken up into planes and shards. There's no chiaroscuro at all in this picture. It's all flat shapes. And the treatment of the background and the bodies is very similar. In fact, if it weren't for the colors, it might be hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Not only that, but look at the two women on the right-hand side. They appear to have distorted faces. During this time, Picasso was being influenced by African masks. He was really obsessed with uh, these wooden masks that various African tribes would carve, and he had a lot of them in his studio. And so, for some reason, he felt like it was appropriate to sort of combine an African mask with an actual female face. Now, why did he do this? We're not really sure. Maybe it suggests disease, sexually transmitted diseases, and these women being corrupted. Maybe it's a way of saying their faces were painted. Or maybe it's because he just thought African masks look cool and they should go on these faces. So this painting is extremely influential and it ushers in kind of the demolishing of Renaissance observed perspective. And in fact, one painter saw this and he said, "The ladies of Avignon made me feel like I was drinking gasoline and spitting fire." And in many ways, this painting ushers in Cubism, which of course is the movement that Picasso is most closely associated with. And it's our next ism. Now, Cubism is a totally new way of looking at the world and of creating art. It basically introduces the concept of showing multiple sides of a single object in one picture. So, for example, if you are painting a chair and you're doing it traditionally, and if you paint the chair at an angle, you might only see two or three legs of that chair. And of course, the chair doesn't cease to have four legs, it still has four, but we can only see three in the picture. Cubism sought to really get at the essential truth of objects by painting a picture as if you were walking around the chair and observing it from all sides and incorporating all sides into one single image. And this is actually the first sort of style of cubism. There are two styles. This is called analytic cubism. Let's look at some examples of it. Analytic cubism is sort of co-invented by Picasso and another artist named Georges Braque. And they work very closely together for this period of time. And sometimes they don't even sign their paintings, and it's hard to know who did what. But the main idea of analytic cubism is analyzing the object you're painting, looking at different sides of it, and combining different views or perspective all in one picture. In a sense, it introduces the element of time into painting as if you are walking around an object. So let's look at this example, Georges Braque's Fishing Boats. This is from 1909. And notice that not all of the boats are seen from the same perspective. We seem to peer down into some of them. We look at some of them a little bit more from the side. Likewise, with these houses that are behind the boats, they appear at different angles. The house at the top, for example, we feel like we're looking up at it, but some of the houses on the sides, it's almost like we're a bird looking down on those houses. So it's a really interesting mixture of different views. And keep in mind, this has origins in part with Cezanne. Cezanne trying to bring together different perspectives all in one image. Here's another example of analytic cubism, Picasso's Girl with the Mandolin. And this figure is fractured into different planes, little shapes that help give cubism its name. It looks almost like little cubes. And we see multiple perspectives, what appears to be the side of the girl's head, but also part of the front, part of a breast. The mandolin itself is composed of different angles, as if you were looking at the mandolin from different sides all at the same time. Classic, quintessential analytic cubism. By the way, notice that unlike the ladies of Avignon, Uh, the figure and the background are very similar colors. It's not like the figure is fleshy colored and the background is blue. They all sort of have this tan gray color about them. This allows us to not get distracted by color changes and to really focus on what's happening spatially and with the planes of the figure. It calls our attention more to the different sides, and it suggests that the old ways of doing things, the old ways of putting a figure in a landscape, are no longer in play anymore. Now the figure and the background, the positive and negative space, interchange and flow together, and it's in many cases hard to separate one from the other. Check out this analytic cubist work by Brock, Woman with the Guitar. Look at the head area, for example. We have overlapping planes, almost like sheets of glass, and there are different parts of the face on each one. So in one, we're kind of looking down on the eye, and another, we see the mouth from the front. If you look at the guitar area, we have the neck of the guitar kind of fractured and broken. The strings are sort of off center. There are two sort of kind of humps uh, that suggest the sides of the guitar. We're not exactly sure where everything is, but we have a general sense that there is a woman here playing a guitar, maybe in front of a table that has some papers on it. Uh, I think it was Picasso who said, Cubism is kind of like perfume. You can smell it in the air all around you, but you can't quite define its edges. So that's certainly the case with a work like this. The next incarnation or phase of Cubism is called synthetic Cubism. And synthetic cubism has similar concerns as analytic cubism, namely observing multiple sides of an object or scene and presenting parts of those sides all in one picture. But it goes beyond by adding some outside elements. For the first time in art history, we have paper collage being done. Here is one of the first works of synthetic cubism, Still Life with Chair Caning. It's by Picasso. And we see he's done a couple of things. One, there's some stuff left over from analytic cubism, the painted lines and shapes kind of towards the top and to the right. But he's also added some cane, some woven cane from the back of a chair. He's glued that down physically onto the canvas here. He's also surrounded it with a rope. So synthetic cubism is basically adding collaged elements to your cubist painting. And some synthetic cubist works become almost entirely collaged elements and minimize the painting part of it. By the way, notice the letters JOU in this picture. One of the things you're going to see in a lot of synthetic cubist collages are torn bits of newspaper and magazines. And most newspapers had the word journaux, I guess the word for newspaper in French, at the top. And sometimes that was torn out and incorporated into these cubist synthetic collages. And it has a double meaning because the French word for to play, jouer, also has the letters JOU. So there's something playful about these works, and we have a sense that Picasso and Braque are kind of having a back and forth as each one is making these works, and they're kind of playing with each other. Here's another synthetic cubist work by Picasso. You can see newspaper pages have been cut out and glued down. There are also some illustrations of fruit at the top, and you see part of a URNAL from journal or newspaper. There is apparently a violin in this picture. You can see pieces of it from different angles. You can see the neck and the tuning pegs up at the top and the body and that blue sheet of paper and the side of it just to the left. So we're still analyzing different sides of an object, but we're using paper collage and other things that have been pasted down on top of this. And here's a final example of synthetic cubism by Georges Braque, where we have imitation wood and advertisements that have been glued down onto a drawing. So this is even more minimal than some of the other synthetic cubist works we've seen. It's really dependent on these glued down parts and has pretty much no painting in it. It looks like it's mostly just charcoal drawing in the background. Okay, so I lied. This is actually our last synthetic cubist work, Pablo Picasso's Three Musicians. It's not as synthetic-y as some of the other works. This has more minimal additions, minimal pieces of paper, and more paint has been brought into this, more flat shapes. But it's a joyful little picture, and one that has certainly become iconic in popular culture when people think about Picasso. We're going to end this module looking at this painting, which is undoubtedly one of Picasso's most famous. It's called Guernica, and it is a massive mural-sized painting that was created in black and white. It is not a color painting, and we're looking at a black and white picture of it. It actually is a black and white painting. Picasso created this work in 1937 in response to a tragedy that had occurred in his native Spain. There's a civil war going on in Spain at this time, with fascist forces led by Francisco Franco uh, being confronted by Republican forces, which were a mix of people from all over the world, kind of freedom loving people in Spain who were also joined by some Americans, but also some socialists and communists. So the Republican forces were kind of a ragtag band. Anyway, Franco, the dictator of Spain, made a deal with Hitler. He gave Hitler, remember this is the 1930s, World War II has not started yet, but Hitler is in power. And he gave Hitler the opportunity to bring in some of his aircraft and practice some of this technology, this awful destructive technology of aerial bombing, on a little town in Spain that was a bastion of Republican forces. This is the town of Guernica in the Basque region of Spain. And so on April 28th, these Nazi bombers came in and they demolished the town of Guernica, and a lot of innocent civilians were killed. This was not a target of military importance. It was simply a chance for Hitler to test out his weapons. And here we see a couple of pictures. We see a Nazi bomber, part of what was called the Condor Legion, dropping a stick of bombs on Guernica. And then we see the town of Guernica in ruins afterwards. And when the world heard about this, there was utter outrage. And Picasso, this having happened in his home country, was especially mad about it. And he created Guernica, the painting, in response to the bombing of this innocent little town. And here we have Picasso resorting to abstraction to try to capture the horror of this event, its tragedy, and also its terror. The picture seems to move from right to left. At least that's the way the faces are pointed. It almost seems like a stampede of people running and some people getting trampled. And there are all sorts of little details that hint at the tragedy. For example, on the far left, there is an abstracted woman holding a child, apparently a dead child. There is a man on the ground. You see him kind of in the bottom left of the picture who's holding a broken sword. We have other figures running. We have a terrified looking horse represented by that head that is running. We have a floating head that appears to be rushing out of a burning building, more towards the right hand side. And on the far right, we have a figure that seems to be swallowed. Its hands are thrown up in despair. In many ways, this painting is representative of the reaction of art to the horror and technological changes of the 20th century. When you have things like the trench warfare of World War I, or a little bit later, in this case, the Spanish Civil War and aerial bombing of innocent civilians with high explosives, suddenly it seems like the old ways of making art, of just doing realism, are insufficient to express the anguish and despair and horror of the modern world. Artists were looking for kind of a new visual vocabulary to somehow express how much the world had changed, how terrifying things could be, and how awful man was treating man. And Guernica is one of those paintings that I think really does this. Uh, it was very much a political painting. In fact, uh, it was exhibited first at the World's Fair in Paris of 1937, and Picasso insisted that this painting never be returned to Spain as long as the dictator Franco was still in power. And in fact, it didn't return to Spain until 1975. There's an apocryphal story about Guernica. During World War II, Picasso stayed in Paris, and of course, the Germans overran Paris. And there's a story about a German soldier who entered Picasso's apartment when Picasso was there, and he saw a reproduction of Guernica hanging on the wall of Picasso's apartment. And this soldier asked Picasso, "Oh, did you do this?" And Picasso supposedly said, "No, you did." Well, that wraps up our study of early 20th century avant garde movements. In the next module, we're going to go deeper into the 20th century, so stick around.